Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. I'm Andrew Morrall. I teach here at the Bar Graduate Centre, and it is really my pleasure and delight this afternoon to welcome our guest, Suzanne Marchand, who is Boyd Professor of Intellectual History at Louisiana State University. Professor Marchand received her PhD from the University of Chicago and taught as assistant and then associate professor at Princeton before taking up her position at LSU. Professor Marchand is widely admired for her work on German reception of classical antiquity and Orientalism that encompasses many fields: classical philology, archaeology, the history of architecture, Oriental philology, and so forth. And she's received many grants and fellowships, including the Humboldt Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, and the Louisiana Board of Regents. She's been a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, the Collegium Budapest in Budapest, the Max Planck Institute for Wissenschaftsgeschichte, and in 2010, she received the American Historical Association's George Moss Prize for the best book in cultural intellectual history for her book, German Orientalism in the Age of Empire, Religion, Race, and Scholarship. In the field, she's been very active, serving as both vice president and then president of the German Studies Association. Among her many publications, I'll mention only a few. Besides the German Orientalism volume, which was also selected as one of Choice's outstanding academic books for 2010. She's written Down from Olympus, Archaeology and Philhellenism in Germany, 1750 to 1970, published by Princeton. Germany at the Fin de Siècle, Culture, Politics and Ideas, which she co-edited with David Lindenfeld. Proof and Persuasion, Essays on Authority, Objectivity and Evidence, co-edited with Elizabeth Lüdenbeck, and now at least into its third edition, a book of which she was one of 7 authors, Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, that was published first in 2002. Now, her most recent book, Porcelain, A History from the Heart of Europe, published by Princeton University Press, and the subject of today's event, marks something of a departure from her earlier work on the reception of classical antiquity and Orientalism, but she's produced an economic and business history of this single commodity, porcelain, but it's one that richly combines cultural and social history over a 300-year span. And I'm actually delighted to say that it's just, I think, in the last couple of days been awarded the Ralph Broomery Book Prize, issued or made possible through the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And this is for work on the effects of business enterprises on the economic conditions of the countries in which they operate. And for anybody, and I hope many of you have already read the book, but if you haven't already, I'd highly recommend it for precisely these qualities. So without more ado, I will hand over to Professor Marchand. Welcome, and after your presentation, we will engage in questions and conversation, and I hope there'll be time for the panelists and for the audience, wider audience, to ask questions as well. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to Andrew and to Peter for organizing this lunch talk. This is a wonderful opportunity to speak to all of you. As Andrew suggested, this was a book that I never intended to write. I'm an intellectual historian by training, and my work usually focuses on cerebral things such as the history of Orientalist scholarship. And in fact, I came to the subject of porcelain by way of Orientalism. I hoped that I could count and track Oriental styles, but I discovered in the course of my meandering research that the topic was so much richer than that, and that I couldn't count those styles directly anyway. And so perhaps I could treat porcelain in a way unique to historians and not so easy for curators or art historians to explore. I must say, however, that my work was completely dependent on legwork done chiefly by museum professionals and art historians. And I was immensely inspired by my visits to many, many museums across Europe and the US in my inquiry. So I'm very pleased to have noticed some museum folks amongst the attendees today. Without that visual education, I could not have written this book. But this is not a book that deals chiefly with porcelain as a form of art, as Andrew suggested. It's chiefly about porcelain as an industry, as a business. This means that I deal early and often with what my literary friend Elsie Mishi calls the vulgar question of money. I also cover a very heterogeneous set of topics in the book which fall outside the usual purview of ceramic historians. This includes, for example, the role of chemists in enabling mass production in various industries, Frederick the Great's attempt to ban his poor subjects from drinking coffee, and the horrors of the Thuringian putting out system. I have sections in the book which deal with the history of peddling and with the DDR's pursuit of hard currency, as well as the Nazis' taste for porcelain Alsatians. I emerged from writing this book feeling that the subject of porcelain is connected to almost any topic in modern history, from international trade to dentistry. As a means of introducing those of you who have not read the book to some of the trajectories I trace, I thought it might be useful to open today's discussion by offering a few images which illustrate the main approach I took, which was again not to discuss porcelain's artistic aims and achievements. That's something I am not at all competent to speak about, but instead to examine the life cycle of this industry and its intersection with Central European social, economic, and cultural life. Thus, in choosing the illustrations, and my goodness, that was really a hard chore, I tried to choose pictures that showed not masterpieces, but humbler, perhaps typical pieces, and especially porcelain in use. So let me begin our conversation today with a few of those images, but especially also with some outtakes that I might have included in the book, but for various reasons did not, to illustrate some of these lines of thought. I hope that they will inspire us to have an interesting discussion and perhaps also inject a little levity into our conversation. So let me now share my screen and hope that we can look at some of these pictures together. Is that full screen, Andrew? We're good? Okay, great. So of course, my story had to start in China with the importation of the first porcelains into Europe. But knowing that so many others have covered this story so well and are so much better able to tell it, I quickly switched my focus to the European industry and especially to the Central Europe portion of that story, the place where the first hard paste porcelain was discovered in Saxony in 1708. Here, I learned some lessons about what it meant to make a discovery, how much money, time, coercion went into the process, and how many people, as well as how much technology transfer was involved. And here you see two fictional versions of the great discovery of hard paste porcelain. This one, which comes from the Albrechtsberg in Meissen, and this is sort of faux movie poster made by another museum in the German states. I also learned in the course of my inquiries into the building of the industry about the strange industrial landscapes of Central Europe, something that is really not so well studied, but which is a fascinating story and involves the repurposing of many palaces and monasteries for the purposes of new kinds of mercantile production. In surveying the 18th century, however, I also investigated the history of table manners, of the ways in which people found it important to serve their guests and how their table decor changed over time. And there I was very much aided by the new history of food, which has become a very active and a very fascinating subject and has helped very much in developing our understanding of how people ate and what they ate when and where. I also investigated, however, already in the 18th century, marketing devices. This is perhaps not so well studied, again, as it ought to be, but I found it fascinating to see what early advertisement looked like and to see how very early on the industry actually dealt with competition on price, at least for some of its manufacturers. And here you see an advertisement for 1765 for Meisen's Turkish cups, that is cups without handles, already being advertised on price. And this was because others were doing the same. This would not have been the case for commissioned objects, of course, but for these more or less batch produced, if not mass produced items, there was already advertising on price as early as 1765. Here are some of the competitors of Meisen, some of those private firms that were founded after 1760, particularly in the area that we now call Thuringia, an area where there were numerous small manufactories, more or less private as opposed to mercantile operations, which began to flood the market with cheaper goods and particularly enjoyed making these small items like Turkish cups. They also made a great deal of ware for the Ottoman Empire, which produced a great number of their sales. One of the things that I focused on in my 18th century story was the importance of non-utilitarian motivations for the princes who made porcelain in their porcelain manufactories to advertise their domains as possessing glans or refinement. Hot drinks were important, but secondary in my view for the state manufacturers, at least in the 18th century. But that was not the case for those private manufacturers. They had the market in view, including the Ottoman market, as I just mentioned. I came to this slide a little early, but let me now introduce it. This is another part of the 18th century story I covered in some detail, and that was the history of the production of so-called biscuit porcelains. First pioneered at Sèvres in France, but then a German specialty. As you can see, these biscuit porcelains came in any number of variations, and for a time replaced sugar sculptures on tables as banquet decorations. They acted as a means gradually of showing something like Bildung rather than Glanz for those who purchased them. That is educational sophistication rather than refinement, as they moved more and more into a kind of neoclassical mode. Of course, their white, bright coloring was meant to resemble marble, but in fact, it really resembled nothing more than plaster casts, which were also cropping up all over Europe by the 18th century. And this set of inquiries led me into some ruminations about neoclassicism and the ways in which white sculpture and the ideal of the white sculpture spread through Europe by way of this decorative art and not only by way of museum exhibitions of casts, which had been previously my presumption. Entering the 19th century proper, I began to find a flourishing world of bourgeois consumption, one that made many porcelain artists unhappy as they wished to present modern designs of their own artistic creation, not copies of old Meisen wares, for example, which took on new popularity after the 1820s, or the sentimental pieces that consumers wanted to buy. I found fascinating the vast array of options offered to consumers in this period, things that offered, for example, personal inscriptions for birthdays or anniversaries or special occasions. Also, there was a long line of porcelain that laid out battle plans, and here you see the battle plan for the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig in 1813. And many things that carried private inscriptions that were added to standardized designs. A very interesting combination of mass production and personalization. Many of these scenes were romantic, tourist landscapes. One could also find many silhouettes, Royal portraits circulated widely as a means of sort of reinscribing the new monarchies of the 19th century in the German states. And there were even some jokes. Pipe design was one of those that was extremely popular and extremely lucrative for many manufacturers. And there are many of these that are not only erotic, but also tell jokes. Another of the things that I learned in the course of my entry into the world of porcelain, and without expecting to find it at all, was the line of porcelains described as electrical technical by the industry, which began to be very important by the third quarter of the 19th century. Manufacturers began to supply things like thread guides for weaving machines and telegraph insulator tubes, as well as glass jet spigots. This is a very important story, extremely important for the economic success of those manufacturers, but it's not so easy to integrate into an artistic history of porcelain. Now we go to the next slide. Of course, labor relations in the factories was a part of the story that I wanted to tell, and I apologize for the fuzziness of this photo. It's really rather hard to find good quality photos, and this one really offers us insight into one of those production processes that we would otherwise perhaps ignore, and that is the history of transfer printing and the ways in which various kinds of mechanisms were developed for the making of transfer, lithographic transfers, for example, of designs to the plates. So speeded up production tremendously, took away many of those manufacturers' art departments, or certainly hand painting departments, got much smaller. And it also enabled the hiring of many more women into the industry, a sure sign, as Maxine Berg told us many years ago, the great historian of British industrial development, a sure sign of the de-skilling and also the capital competition for price in this world, as women were typically paid between 1/3 and 1/2 of male salaries. There's a whole lot more that one could say about labor relations in this industry, very little of it very savory. Another thing that was rather difficult to study, but I found fascinating in my researches, was retailing. How did things actually get sold? Who sold porcelain and how? Of course, it's a very delicate kind of product. It can't simply be toted around with great ease, especially those delicate figurines. So I did some digging to try to figure out where and how it was sold. One of the things that I finally figured out was that it was sold in very many different ways, from peddlers who somehow managed to keep their wares from breaking, or at least many of them, to kitchenware sellers. There's also a big story here about the relationship between producers, cartels, and retailers' organizations. And that story boils down to lots of infighting, basically. And there's a whole history of the department stores' use of these products too that we could also fold into our account. Of course, modern porcelain does have a role to play, and I did try to bring the story of modern design into my book as much as I could without being, of course, a connoisseur of porcelain. But here I also wanted to stress the ways in which the old persisted and the new had to be cheap, had to appeal to a lower income class of consumers in order to survive. The modern was very difficult to sell if it was not cheap, and many of those sort of iconic modern porcelain designs that we know and love from museums were actually failures on the market. And I'm afraid this has become the story for a great deal of the modern wares more generally. One of those that did survive is this particular particular brand or particular make. And it was made in very, very many wares and sold extremely widely. I talked some in the book about the confiscation of porcelain from Jewish owners after 1933. And I attempted there to tell just a few of the stories of the confiscation, both of actual manufactories like the Rosenthal manufactory and also the confiscation of collections from individual owners. This again is a much bigger story that I couldn't possibly cover in detail. But you see here one of the warehouses for the holding of some of those items, and you can see just how much the Nazis collected of just everyday china of ordinary wear from their owners. The story of post-war attempts to repossess these kind of wares is also a fascinating and generally heartbreaking one. There is a great deal more to be done, I think, also on the ways in which the loss of those objects, or in some cases, the protection of those objects by family members, carries on stories and traditions that families still hold very dear. Another surprise for me was to learn about what happened to the industry and particularly to the Meissen manufactory after the dividing of the two Germanys, because some of those manufactories, and most importantly Meissen, did fall behind the Iron Curtain. So what was a socialist state going to do with a Baroque porcelain manufactory that was, from its get-go, organized for the production mostly of artifacts for the aristocracy? Well, as it turned out, attempts at Meissen to make socialist porcelain were utter failures. No one wanted them, they didn't sell. And so the Meissen manufactory did hit on a successful mechanism, and that was making old style porcelain for the Western market. And that was a strategy pursued by the manufacturer, particularly after 1960, and it netted quite a lot of hard currency for a very strapped state. It also continued through the traditions of the past and made it possible for the manufacturer to survive communism, interestingly, with an actually larger workforce than it would have either previous to the breakdown of Germany or after its unification. And finally, the story ends with the flea market, with where a lot of this porcelain has ended up, and with the difficulty of those who have inherited so much of all of those centuries of production in figuring out what to do next, what to do with those family histories, what to do with those figurines, with all of that stuff that meant so much to their parents, to their grandparents, but which does not seem to have the same place in either home life or in artistic life as it once had. And this is part two of the industry's collapse. Since 2009, it was already in trouble at that point, but since then it has been on the downward skids. Many of those manufactories of the previous centuries and generations have closed, and it's anybody's guess, where the industry will go now. Meissen still is in production. It's still a state-owned industry. It's the only one left that has been continuously state-owned since the 18th century, but it is in terrible debt. And just about every year, the Saxon Landtag considers whether or not to close the manufactory. I really don't anticipate that happening, as Meissen has become such a symbol for Saxony and part of its cultural patrimony. But still, this is a kind of poignant moment, which it's not clear what the future of Meissen is, or what the future of at least the production of artistic porcelains as an industry holds. It's clear that porcelain will go on as an art form. Many people are still occupied in that, not least Edmund de Waal, who wrote the beautiful Hair with the Amber Eyes and the White Road, and who continues to produce many beautiful installations. But it's not clear how long it will survive as an industry, and what new public it might find. So that's my little overview of the stories the book tells, and I'm more than happy to hear any questions or comments you might have.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sue. That was it's a lovely taster for a very richly textured book that you produced. I have a few questions I just like, broad questions really, that I'd like to pose before we open up the field to our audience. But one is really as an economic history. In a very large sense, your book is a history really of the slow transition of the German state's economy from this mercantilist system of princely patronage and financing to a more or less open market, capitalist market. And one of the particular points of interest is to see a kind of push and pull tension between these two systems, which, as you say, still exists in a way with Meissen today. It's a state industry, terribly unprofitable, but kept alive by a notion of Meissen as a kind of cultural symbol. And one, as you say, one wonders whether that notion of the symbolic nature will actually transition in the future as porcelain declines in popularity as a commercial possibility into historical museums and collections, and will exist there as a kind of historical entity. But at the moment, it is actually being kept alive by industry. So I suppose my question was, your choice of porcelain as the way to tell that broader story of mercantilism to capitalism, if you like, and industrialization. What was it about porcelain that made you choose porcelain rather than some other, product of industry, steel or precision engineering, other forms of industry that or products that have a kind of essential Germanness to them? Would that story be very different if told through another lens? Or in other words, what has allowed you to tell a particular story of that transition through porcelain?
So many interesting parts to that question, Andrew. Let me say that there's one volume that treats the porcelain industry, the title of which is Kunst oder Kommerz, that is, art or commerce. And this has been a contradiction in the business almost since the beginning. And it's perhaps one of the things that most interests me about this particular industry. Like some other luxury industries, but even more so, early on, the presumption was that this would be mostly an art, but very soon commercial interests got to be a big part of this. I think in part because German princes, with the exception of a very few, Prussian and the Saxons, were generally relatively poor. And there's a period at the end of the 18th century in which the screws are tightened on the manufactories, and the art production just has to give way to commercial production. This is partly the story that's also told with respect to competition with Wedgwood. Yeah. And in France, for example, Sèvres succeeds and continues to go on because it has very lavish state patronage, and it has a huge market, even though it can't entirely count on the monopoly. But that helps a great deal to make that context a bit different. That is, there's only one, whereas in the German states, there are many competing manufactories, and the French monarchy and then state has pretty deep pockets to support Sèvres. The British industry, of course, is very different, as they are all private manufactories, some of them with state or with royal sort of imprimatur, but they're not at all supported by the regime directly. So it makes for a very interesting way of telling the story of, I think, a kind of German or Central European industrialization that runs in different ways and has many different pieces to it than the story of coal or steel that we've been told it's a history of smaller manufactories fitting into a wider market and trying to find their way. So it makes for an interesting and different way to tell the history of German economic development, which also I think gives us a different way of understanding that industrial revolution, which otherwise seems just so British and also so dominated by those heavy industries and not by consumer-oriented production.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of the fascinating parts of your book is to see how the German state's mercantilist system grapples with the onslaught, if you like, of Dutch and British, methods and instruments of production and marketing that then intrude into their own markets. And it never takes, the idea of the female consumer that you have in certainly, in the tea ceremony and so on, as driving production in England, for instance, never takes hold, or it takes hold in very different ways in Germany, which are very, very socially, I think, very, very interesting. You talk about the rise of the public sphere and the cafe, the coffee culture and so on, as well as coffee in the home. But there's a very, the German households didn't have the consumer power, it seems to me, that the more open market economies developed. Is that fair to say?
This is absolutely true. It's one of the things I'm still trying to get my head around entirely, how, and it's hard to study how and when did female consumers become the sort of drivers of this industry and its taste. But I can say that even if you look at statistics for about 1913, just before the First World War, household income per average is much higher in Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium than in the German states. So the consumer demand really comes later, certainly later than Britain, and I think later than particularly Paris. And I think it takes a while for consumers to begin to exert some pressure on this market. And I think female consumers are constrained by both various kinds of either sumptuary laws or expectations for what it means to be a good housekeeper, a frugal housekeeper above all. And then I think also just by the general poverty of the region after the Napoleonic Wars. This is very pronounced. We've sort of forgotten about this, but the 1820s, teens and 20s are very, very hard. And it's not called, the Hungry 40s for nothing, too. So there is a period of real stagnation or slow development before a really sharp takeoff after 1860.
Well, I want to say your book speaks to what we do at the Bard Graduate Center absolutely directly. Of taking, working from objects in essence and building this larger history around them and showing their significance, if you like. But you haven't written a book. There are lots of books on cotton or on salt, or I think of Simon Schaffer's use of the automaton as both origin for the industrial machine and as metaphor, if you like, for the industrialization process. But yours is a very different history, I think, to those kinds of object histories, if you like.
I think so. I'd like to know, what other people would say about that. I didn't intend to do a kind of commodity history because I did really want the industry to be the focus rather than the commodity itself. But of course, I've been inspired by those books to focus in the same way on one product and kind of trace it through. But it is super rewarding to investigate this kind of material culture because it takes you in so many possible different directions. And I will say that there are still many, many subjects out there, particularly for German history, I think, or Central European history more generally, that deserve and need that kind of treatment. I've said before, and I'll say again, I think that there's been for a long time a sense in German history that it needs to focus on serious topics And this is, of course, because of Germany's terrible 20th century history. And of course, those topics absolutely are crucial. But it has, in a way, impeded a bit of the kind of cultural history that American historians and French historians and British historians have done so beautifully and so well. And so I think we may now be at the point where we can dare to do a little bit more of that. And we have all of those people showing us the way about how we can do this well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. One other question that, again, addressing a broad theme of your book, and that is the history of taste, which comes up repeatedly over the 300 years, and the place of porcelain within it. But it's so interesting from an art historian's point of view to see the history of taste taken from an economic point of view, and how economics drives taste. And I just wanted to ask, how do you think this lens of economic and business history might provide counterpoint or even corrective to more traditional histories of porcelain's reception?
A very, very good question. I think for one thing, it really tells us more about sort of what is happening at the mass level and how those kinds of things dictate possibilities for other things. I think must be in the fashion industry, you all will know much more about this, the same sort of runway production as opposed to the production for people like me on the part of all of those fashion producers. But to see those levels is very important. I will also say that and this also, of course, tells us about lags in taste and the way in which taste can be shaped by other factors other than by art or by leading, elites in society. And finally, I'll say that the other thing that economic history provides an interesting corrective to is the history of science, which is another field that I love and borrow from all the time. Sometimes there, the important thing seems to be, sort of new discoveries intellectually. And so stuff like the history of industrial chemistry actually gets sidelined, not after 1860, but the history of industrial chemistry and its relationship to the Industrial Revolution is something I think understudied, again, in part because there isn't so much interest in that business side of chemistry and more in the sort of discovery side. So maybe there's an interesting parallel there.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things I found so striking were your accounts of the resentments of individual artisans at the factories at this transition point to industrialization and profitability, at having to make things they actually considered ugly, and how, if you like, they transition from being leaders of taste, of aristocratic taste and so forth, to followers of popular taste, in quite, with the pipe bowls and the replicas of famous paintings on porcelain and so on and so forth. It's an extraordinary story of taste production and resistance to taste at the source of production.
That was again a surprise for me, and I'll tell you that in a way my favorite section of my own book is a very strange selection, and that is a little section called Porcelain in the Gimlet Eye of the Finance Ministry. And this is about the ways in which finance ministries worked to discipline precisely production and taste, because they were tired of artisans simply producing things they thought were beautiful and didn't sell well or weren't marketable. That is to me, a very deeply telling story about the history of labor relations, about the history of mass production. It works in that case in the mercantilist vein as well as in the capitalist vein, because there it's state imposed, but elsewhere it's market forces that make that happen.
Your book is beautifully illustrated. You've got lots of really, really telling illustrations. One of my favorites is a photograph of a group of women painting dolls' heads in an outsourced Hausmalerei context of their living room almost, or their own workshop. from 1927. So it's very, very late. And the photograph tells us lots of things. One, the continuation of artisanal practices as an old, ancient, centuries old, into the 20th century. I don't know how unique this is to the porcelain industry. But also, and I think you make the point about how the dress of those women has, just takes on nothing of modernity. And how deeply rooted in tradition, both the products and the society in which they're made actually remains. This in a larger context of design reform and the Bergbund and the Bauhaus, and in a sense, the tensions that the factories had in trying to come to terms or adapting or not adapting to those demands of the design reformers.
It's such a striking thing to think about that picture compared to the 1382 picture that I showed. It is just astonishing to me how long that essentially putting out system continued in particularly in Thuringia. And I think there are plenty of other industries in which that might well be the case as well. All sorts of things like artificial flower making, for example, things we don't think of, artificial jewelry, those kinds of things. Lots of those half artisanal, half mass produced kinds of industries we've sort of obscured in our rush to think of everything as mechanized. But it's a lovely picture, and I was delighted to find it because it really did evoke that old world and its continuities.
I'll have one last question, general question, before I open this up to the to others. And this is another part of the story. Really, is the way porcelain continues to be a powerful cultural symbol, and all the way to Meissen today, keeping it desperately on as a sort of symbol of Kultur, of Germanness. Do you have a sort of easy answer to that persistence of the medium? Other historians have pointed to things like Dürer, which is close to my own field, Dürer's Knights, Death and the Devil, and have shown its continuation and manipulation and so on by different forms of culture and ideology. There are various different kinds of objects have served as this sort of model of cultural symbolism. What is it about porcelain that has allowed it to act in a similar way?
Of course, there's no easy answer, Andrew, of course. I'd say, on the one hand, there is a feeling that some of this holds on to an older 18th century Germany that is something that that one wants to preserve against the ugliness of the 20th century. But the other part of it is really family memories. A lot of what gets preserved, as you know, from a piece you showed me earlier, because of family memories and holiday memories of using the porcelain for specific kinds of feasts or celebrations, or because it's a remnant of a world that's lost. Sometimes I think it indicates grandmother more than it does, almost anything else. But it's a wonderful thing to hear people's porcelain stories about their lives and what those objects mean. And for some reason, I think partially it's malleability, but all those other things I mentioned, it does have a central place in a lot of people's sense of their own past.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you so much. I think this is a good moment, I hope it's not too late, to throw the floor open to questions. So once again, if there are panelists who would like to raise their hands, and we have a lot, I think I'll start with them, and then I'll go on to the Q&A questions from the broader audience. I'll start with Ivan.
Can you hear me? Yes. I don't think I was first, but thanks, Andrew. Thank you so much. This looks like a fascinating project. I have to admit, I've not read your book, but I expect to. I'm really gratified by the way in which you have not been limited to decorative arts works generally understood. And I'm fascinated by the electrical insulators. And thinking of those in particular, I'm wondering about this intersection of economic and cultural concerns. And I'm wondering about the secondary markets for things and secondary uses. And that, of course, can range from the sales of the development of a taste for Ancien Régime porcelain in the 19th century, and the growth of what comes to be known as the antique trade, to flea markets, to something that we touched on in a project 5 years ago here at Bard Graduate Center, which was by our BGC American Museum of Natural History postdoctoral fellow, Sean Rowlands. And this was, he had among the things in his project, these Kimberley points. They're sometimes made of glass. These happen to be made of porcelain. And they are derived from electrical insulators that Indigenous Australians in Western Australia repurposed in accordance with lithic technology to make spear points. So that's one extreme of a repurposing of as it were, if you like, I don't think market, but a secondary subsequent use of these things. And I wondered if subsequent uses had come into your picture.
Thank you. I'll just say briefly, there are a lot of these other utilitarian objects that are fascinating and kept the market going, one of which is floor tiles. And the other is all sorts of hygienic wares, including bathroom fixtures, which is what keeps Villeroy and Bosch going now, for example. So those sorts of things are crucial to my story. I hadn't thought so much about the secondary market or substitutes in that way, but I do know that many of those porcelain objects have been, some of them have been repaired or repaired into other things. And some of them also have been repurposed, for example, into chandeliers and so on. So there is definitely, you know, some interesting work to be done on the reuse of all of that porcelain ware. The antique trade is a fascinating one, and already, you know, in the 1820s, the great popularity of Vieux Sèvres or Altmeisen becomes just a thing that is really, really powerful. So there's a whole story there about old and new to be told as well.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Freya, yes, has her hand up.
I'm so sorry, my raise hand function is not working. That's why I'm using my good old physical hand here. But Suzanne, this was so fascinating, and I can't wait to read your book, and I can't wait to teach your book. And I also realized that I'm on the GSA panel that you and Mary Lindemann organized for the fall. All this was seeming very familiar, and all of a sudden my brain put everything together. So I'm even more excited about that than I was before. But I had a couple of questions, and maybe you'll have to limit yourself to one because I don't want to take up all the time. But so one of them is related to something that Andrew asked, and that's about material, I think. And I've worked a good bit on German stoneware, and a lot of similar arguments could be made about stoneware and its production and the moments when it's sort of going into decline, and it's sort of the question of mass production and serial production and artisanal production, and how all those are pretty murky in a way. And I'm wondering if you thought about stoneware as you were working on this, or you know, where that might come in.
Absolutely. One of the things that, of course, I couldn't cover in detail, but is definitely in the book, is the competitor markets to porcelain, because faience, for example, and stoneware were always produced in more quantities than porcelain, always. Majolica, always a bigger market. And those were competitor industries porcelain had to deal with somehow. and had to define itself against. Because they could do some of the same things, but not all. And it was one of the things driving porcelain into a higher bracket, that is to say, of consumers than otherwise perhaps might have been the case. But it's definitely part of the whole picture to look at these things together. Porcelain has superior insulating qualities, so it got the edge in some of those discussions about material. What material you need. Teapots just don't break as easily with poured hot water into them if they're porcelain. At least that was what the porcelain maker said. But in any event, it is definitely part of the picture that it needs to be put into place, and certainly many of the same things as you've said apply. And I'm so glad you're in the GSA seminar. We'll have great time.
Very quickly, the other question, which I'm kind of maybe more interested in, is this question of after, you know, the fate of Meissen in East Germany. And, you know, as you were speaking about sort of these socialist porcelain that totally fails, and then the export market, I was also thinking about what happens, especially in the late 50s and early 60s in the DDR, that's really about kind of trying to reclaim so much of this German culture, almost in a pre-capitalist sense, right? And almost sort of like, well, we are, the DDR is the true home of Goethe, the true home of Meissen, kind of somehow trying to, lay claim to all of those things that are kind of culture that the West has basically screwed up and violated. And I don't know if that's also something that comes into that discourse around kind of what do we do with Meissen in Dresden now, or not.
I don't think so, Fran. I think it was a purely economic move that was made to save the manufactory, which was losing money hand over fist. And the only solution was to produce 18th century reproductions that were embarrassing, in fact, to the communist makers, because they found them so, resonant of the whole world of aristocratic culture. So I think in that case, it was really about money.
Okay, thank you.
I now have Peter.
So Andrew, I have my question, but maybe we should let Heath go first.
For sure, Heath.
Thank you, Peter. It wasn't that dire, but I have also not read your book, and I'm definitely going to. I like your take on a lot of things, but I wanted to know if you had any thoughts that might be in your book about England's choice not to pursue the production of hard-paced porcelain. And I see that choice as a political one, because they could argue that it's more expensive. They have all the materials, but ultimately bone china is equally as expensive due to having to fire more often rather than a really high fire. And then they produce an inferior product, and that pursues. And I'm just curious how you feel about the politics of that choice, and what you think it means for the longevity, or did it predict a faltering market of hard-paced porcelain before anyone else?
That's interesting. Heath, we'll have to talk about this more, because I don't know as much about the English industry as I think you probably do. But my understanding was that it really had to do with the availability of proper clay. That is, and this is another piece of this, is that clay gets very expensive to move around. It's very heavy. And if you have it in your backyard, it's easier to possess it. And manufacturers that had a good supply of nearby clay had a real economic advantage. And that was not true of England, that they did not have kaolin, and only late found some deposits that were not the same but usable. But Wedgwood was importing from the US for a while, actually, to make his stoneware. So my understanding was that it was not so much political, but economic, based on the availability of the proper forms of clay. But as I say, that that we'll have to talk about or investigate a little closer. I mean, the other striking and important thing about the English industry is that early on, the English industry, notably Wedgwood, learns to fire with coal. That's something the continental producers cannot figure out how to do until about 1815. They make some experiments, but they almost all fail. And that is a huge cost savings if you can use coal rather than wood. So the English already had a cost advantage in terms of the use of coal, which they used to great effect, especially Wedgwood, once again. But I don't know whether this is somehow related, but somehow the materials, I think, are a big part of that competition. It's also true that the English are importing still until at least the 1790s a lot of Asian porcelain, and it may be that was sufficient for those who wanted porcelain rather than buying continental. There were tariffs also. Another one of those long-term stories is the endless amount of tariffs on various kinds of things. So that could be also a piece of it, but it's something that I can't give you a perfect answer to, but deserves some more scrutiny.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Can I move now to Jen, who, on the question of techniques and technicalities, perhaps, not wishing to anticipate. So
can you hear me? Great. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation, Suzanne. That was fascinating. And I can't wait to read the book. I think it touches on a number of areas for people that study porcelain technology that we need to look into more deeply. And I actually had a question about something that starts in the 1760s in Thuringia, and then we sort of lose track of, which is we see the development of a house smaller industry that we think is, enamelers from Meissen that are taking pieces home with them, whether they're underglazed blue or whitewares, painting them, and then wind up competing with their own companies. And we're starting to see, as we analyze more and more of these wares, whether they're hollow wares or tablewares or figures that have 18th century bodies, but 19th century overglazed enamel. And there's always that huge question, who is doing this? Where is this coming from? And I wonder if your research gave you any insight into these questions.
Wonderful question, Jennifer. The house smaller are definitely part of the story because the manufacturers hated them, tried to do away with them, tried to ban them, and they couldn't do it. They never, in fact, they ended up just sort of saying, all right, if we can't beat you, we'll join you, and producing for house smaller. I mean, Philip Rosenthal started off as a business as a house smaller, essentially, or at least his wife was. It's just a persistent issue. I think that that a lot of the people were renegades from the industry who were poorly paid and wanted to do something else or something on the side. But then it becomes also an industry in which there are quite a lot of women who undoubtedly do this at home and are either, selling for themselves or else their husbands are sort of tasking them to do these things. But it's a really important story, and it's one that the industry was plagued by forever. It's a fascinating one. And for those of you who don't know what a house smaller is exactly, it's somebody who painted at home, that is at the house, rather than in the manufactory. The manufacturers wanted all the painters on site because the painted ware was much higher priced than whiteware. So they wanted to control the market for the painted wares, but that was in practice really never possible.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
We've now reached the 1:15, actually 1:16 stage of the afternoon. So I know students and others might have to go to classes, so please feel free to leave if you have to. But if you're okay, I'd love to sort of continue the conversation. We have 2 questions from Peter and Deborah left on screen, and then we have 3 questions in the Q&A that I hope we can get to. So can I, Peter, let me ask you.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'll be really quick because I'm actually one of those people who has to leave at 1:15. So Sue, that was great. Really, it's not easy to to present a long book very quickly and still make it compelling and exciting for all the things in it and the things that are not in it. One of the things you said, just tossed off in that vein, was how you noted that some of the Meissen patterns that were most admired by, let's say, the aesthetically inclined, whether art historians or museum professionals, in fact, were economic failures. And I'm wondering if, if along the way writing this book, you began to get a sense of what a counter art history might look like if it was written from the perspective of business history.
Interesting. It would not, I think, value innovation as much as we do in museum histories or in artistic histories, because there is certainly less innovation in popular taste, more continuity, but also much more sort of wide variety of different kinds of patterns and different kinds of shapes for different purposes. It would be a fascinating idea to think about that. The bestsellers, this is something that occasionally literary historians look into, and it is really remarkable when you see what actually sold when, let's say, in the same year that Madame Bovary was published, for example, the most popular works are really devotional works, for example, or kind of bodice rippers. So we could do this with any number of our disciplines, and it would be a fascinating way to see, the levels and the ways in which we work between these levels. Even historians could do this, and it would be fascinating to see, popular histories versus academic histories. I think we would all be saddened by the result, as probably porcelain artists would be by a history told in that way. But it would definitely be an interesting juxtaposition.
Well, there's a wonderful challenge for someone to take out. That'd be great. So Deborah, last of our panelists' questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was fascinating talk, and like everyone else, I look forward to reading the book. And I actually work on the history of food and the interaction between food and decorative arts and material culture. And I'm curious, your statement at the beginning of your talk that there was a relationship between dining culture and porcelain reminded me of the argument that Richard Galtwaite makes in an article that all of our students read about the relationship between the sort of the growth of and it's not really an industry, but people call it an industry of maiolica in the 16th century and changes in food. And I wonder whether you are making a similar kind of argument. I mean, it's also striking that Richard Galtwaite is also an economic historian, so he's using some of the same tools that you are to make that relationship make sense.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a complicated question. One of the things that I did decide, I think I decided after some speculation, was that the porcelain industry was really not initially developed and patronized for the sake of food service. Particularly, that has been argued in the case of sort of coffee and tea. And that just doesn't really work for Central Europe, when very few people were drinking coffee or tea in the late 17th, early 18th century, very, very few. But what did happen was that once those kinds of products began to spread more quickly, particularly coffee in Central Europe, then a line of products designed for use for hot drinks did become more widely sold and became part of the industry, as well as those Turkish cups being sold to the Ottoman Empire. So although initially the building of those manufactories was more for decoration of palace walls and palace tables. Eventually, those food items began to shape the industry more powerfully. Dessert was also very much associated with porcelain. It was associated with tropical commodities and with sweets to begin with, and not with full meals, let's say, and which for the elite continued to be served on silver rather than on porcelain for a long time. So it's a relationship that does develop and becomes very important, but it's hazy and not direct at the beginning.
Right, that's what I would have expected. So thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So if I could now turn to the questions solicited from the wider audience. I have a question here from Jacqueline Bishop, who asks, one of the things I wondered is the impact of the slave industry in the New World on the manufacturing industry of porcelain. In other words, I was wondering if the money that came with sugarcane and plantation society drove porcelain production in mainly England and France. In other words, I was wondering if the money that came with sugarcane and plantation society drove porcelain production, mainly England and France, as there was demand for such luxury items as porcelain. In other words, is there a connection?
Is there a connection? Well, of course, all of these industries are in some way connected, and the sugar industry certainly has strong connections to the increased drinking of those hot drinks, and by that extension to porcelain. There is also a very large market in South America for particularly for British and French porcelains, later on for German porcelains. And many of those people were undoubtedly slaveholders and plantation owners. I don't doubt that. It's not something I've looked into directly, and I think you'd have to take a wider angle to see that relationship. But of course, you know, those trade relationships are important across all of those commodities.
Thank you. Then I have a question from Diana Young. Thanks so much for your wonderful talk. I was sad and shocked to hear that the Meissen factory is not a commercial success at the moment. Why doesn't Meissen produce works meeting contemporary tastes and needs? And in an Asian perspective, kilns in Japan and China produce various works for tourists and locals. They seem to make money by adjusting their traditional designs to cater to modern tastes. What might be the possible obstacles for Meissen to pursue international buyers?
Excellent question. I think that Meissen has tried this. It just seems that the saleable line is the old stuff. The famous onion pattern and the figurines are perpetual money spinners. I think Meissen is not known for and has never been very good at, in my very humble and not very educated opinion, in producing modern designs. It was not good at it at the turn of the century. I don't think it has the capacity. But then I think the problem is that many people who want modern designs can find them cheaper made by somebody else. And so it's just a problem of the market. And I'm not sure there is a solution. They made some very bad decisions in the 1990s in some of their attempts to kind of broaden the brand too much, and tried opening a store in Beijing that was much, much too big, and they got overextended. But they have tried some of those things, and I think it's just not easy for them to figure out what a workable business model might be. And boy, I don't have any answers to that. If I learned anything in writing this book, it's that getting into business is tough, and staying in business is tougher. And I do not think I have any recipes for how to do any of that well.
Thank you. I mean, this is interesting how, porcelain has managed to mold itself to, express different cultural values across time. And now it just seems to be the idea of glance that you talk about, of aristocratic sheen, is so out of fashion, and I think it still attaches to porcelain today. So it's difficult. I have a question here about from someone I can't identify, unfortunately, but thank you for the fascinating presentation. After Meissen starts producing porcelain, is there still a market for Asian porcelain in Germany? Does Asian porcelain hold a higher status than domestic production? Or do Meissen and the German porcelain compete? Yeah. Once Sèvres is founded, what is the relative status of Sèvres versus Meissen? Is there an element of national pride or the cachet of foreign production that play in the reception?
It's all excellent questions. You know, the first one, Asian porcelain, does continue to appeal for quite a while, and is looked upon as being superior for at least 2 decades after the first invention by the Meissen factory. But then a series of tariffs and also problems in the Asian industry cut that off. Plus, the European German makers begin to cultivate new styles and also use their own versions of Oriental designs to kind of beat that market. So it becomes harder for the Asians to produce wares that at least at the higher end will compete, but there is still a great deal of cheaper porcelain coming in by way of the Dutch. That just continues for a long time, and it would be very interesting to study that in more detail. The other moment at which the Asian market is really important is the rise of the Japanese producers in the early 20th century. And they begin to compete very avidly for European and American markets in particular. And after the Second World War, that will be a very big portion, again, of the trade. Sèvres is another fascinating story. There's some in the book about that, so I won't go into it in detail, but it becomes the art leader first in the 1760s, and that's troubling for the German firms. And then through the 19th century, Sèvres continues to be the art leader for the most part, with which Meissen is desperately trying to compete with not as lavish funding. So it's a long and interesting competition between those two manufacturers.
Thank you so much. And that actually answers the other question and final question from the audience, which was, does the book cover any of the economic battles between Sèvres and Meissen? And of course, yes, is the simple answer. So we're coming up to 1:30 now, and I think it's the time to end the session. So I just want to thank you, Sue, so much for such an incredibly rich conversation and presentation, and also to highly recommend the book, which I see from, I think the flyer that we sent out can be obtained at a reduction right now. So do take advantage. And on the question of popular taste, I just want to have a little puff for our own BGC forthcoming Majolica show, which opens in the fall, and which will actually deal very directly with this issue of extraordinariness, if you like, of popular taste. So Sue, thank you. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you for the audience, wherever you may be right now, for joining us, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your excellent questions. Wonderful to talk to you all.